some prizes. Oy vey, let's get some prizes. Oy vey, let's get some prizes. Later in the Seder, soon may our freedom come to bring us liberty, peace, and fun. One day when the Pharaoh's outdone, he'll let my people go.
Now Pharaoh's heart was not appeased. No Hebrew slave shall ever go free. But Moses said, let's wait and see. The plagues began to grow.
Oy! Soon may our freedom come to bring us liberty, peace, and fun. One day when the Pharaoh's outdone, he'll let my people go. Oh.
Just lean to the left and we'll tell the tale of how we left Egypt. God split the sea and we walked across with no need for a ship.
But first, before we get to that, there's sons and questions for. Just when you think it's almost done, there's 3 hours more.
There's 3 hours more.
For Pharaoh sent men after us, their lives would soon be lost.
Hello, my holy sisters and brothers. It's great to be with you. That was a Passover song. We're obviously past Passover, but I was sorry I didn't come across it during Passover. That was the a cappella group, very good for the Omer period. 613 singing the Red Sea Shanty. Beautifully done. How you doing? Let's light up the darkness. Whoa. We have a lot to do today. We have a double DAF, so we're going to do pages 21 and 22 here in Tractate Shekalim, the 5th volume of the Talmud. That will bring us to the end of Shekalim, so we'll do the Hadron, the set of blessings that we say when we finish a tractate of study, and then we'll just do the first line of the next tractate, which is Yoma, a fascinating tractate, much larger than Shekalim, and that will be on the Laws of Yum Kippur. All right, let me just get this set up over here. Who is with us as we get it going on a Monday evening? Paula in Chicago, James in Indianapolis, Tom in Pennsylvania, Melissa in Great Neck, Renee in Indy, Pauline in Arkansas, Stephen in New Hampshire, Carol in Cleveland, Yehudit in South Carolina. Tom says, never heard this version before regarding that song. Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey. Bill in Berkeley. He says, I do love me some Talmud shanties. Stephen in Oklahoma. Paula in the Great Northwest. Jeff, talking about receiving your mezuzah, presumably from mezuzah.org. Not sure what's going on there. We just make people aware of mezuzah.org, but we don't handle their fulfillment. Spencer says, Kol hakavod, toda rabah, yasher koach. All honor to you. Thank you so much. May you be strengthened. Sal and Nina from Hartford, Connecticut. Sammy in Dallas. Nancy in North Carolina. PK in Colorado. Lindsay in Cincinnati. Lucy in Minneapolis under curfew. May peace prevail as soon as possible. Wilson in Boston. Paula loves that Gilligan's Island melody. Erin in La Mirada. Belle on the road with her husband and saying shalom. Max is a skeptic. Aaron, hi from GH. What's GH? I guess I ought to know what GH is, but I'm not sure. Debbie in Georgia. Elvis in New York. Anne in Merced. Pedro in Orlando. Okay. Where am I? Over there on the YouTube side. Let me do a reload there. Nina is on the road attending my son's baseball game, so I'm on my own today and just trying to get everything going. Neil in Virginia. Gigi wishing us shalom, and Cohen Lave, I'm not sure who that is, asking about Edmund Fitzgerald, and I'm sorry I don't know what that means. All right, everybody, let's get busy. Like I said, we have a lot to cover. Just quickly following up on two questions that came up yesterday. I was mentioning who are Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi is the redactor, sort of responsible for putting the Mishna in its final form, and Ravina and Rav Ashi are the redactors of the Gemara, and therefore thus putting the Talmud in its first and final form, as it were, setting in writing the teachings of the Gemara, primarily responsible for that as editors, as it were, were Ravina and Rav Ashi. There's also a question yesterday, is there a distinction between offerings and sacrifices? And I said that we basically use these terms interchangeably. And it was interesting, the Hebrew word, the usual word for that is zevach. And I actually saw in the Art Scroll Siddur today, in the prayer book, where it was talking, in the offerings that are described in the morning prayers, the same word was translated as offering and then later as sacrifice. So really they're being used interchangeably until we have a reason to make distinctions, and we'll get much more into the nuances of the particular sacrifices and why they brought and how they're brought and how and where they're brought, etc. When we get to tractate Zevachim about sacrifices. Okay. So we're going to start on page 21, and we're at the end of chapter 7. So we're just going to have just a little bit to wrap up chapter 7 and then get into chapter 8. So just a last commentary on the third Mishnah, I believe, here in chapter 7. Let's just double check. The third Mishnah, final comments on the third Mishnah of chapter 7. The Mishnah taught that one who derives benefit from the ashes of a red heifer is not liable for misusing property consecrated to the temple. Now, that's very counterintuitive. If you make personal use in any way, even inadvertently, of property objects that have been consecrated to the temple. In other words, they've been given to the temple for use basically in bringing the offerings of the nation. Then if you make any personal use of that, then you're guilty of a transgression. It's a sin, misappropriating consecrated property of the temple. And then you have to go through your own atonement process for that. So any kind of offerings, any kind of donation, monies that were donated, animals that were donated, vessels that were donated, anything that already belongs to the temple, if you somehow make personal use of it, you're guilty of that sin. And that's why the temple always gets the upper hand in all business transactions, that just in case the market price changed and there was a vendor selling, sheep to the temple that are going to be used as offerings, and he sold it at a price that was yesterday's price, but today the price dropped, and so he's making a little bit more money on selling the sheep to the temple than he would have otherwise if the temple and he had been aware that the market price dropped. Because of situations like that, the temple always has a little bit of an edge, and that's to protect the vendor from coming even advertently to benefit personally from consecrated property. So now, why does it say that the ashes of the red heifer, if you use those in some way, you're not guilty of this transgression? And as we'll see, so first of all, what are the ashes of the red heifer? There were only 9 red heifers in the history of the Jewish people. These were cows that were absolutely pure red, more like a rust color, but unblemished in any other way, no other colors on them. From the time they were calves, they were identified as pure red heifers, and no work was ever done with them. Nobody ever benefited from the red heifer. And then eventually it was taken to a special place. It was slaughtered. It was burned. And then the reason for that the red heifer was important is that its ashes would be collected, stored, and from time to time some of those ashes mixed with very pure spring water, and those become the waters of purification for a person who touched a dead body and then needs to be purified, go through a special purification process before he can be declared ritually pure again and thus qualified to enter the grounds of the temple. Right? He did a good deed by burying a dead body. That's kind of the highest of the good deeds that you can do, or among the highest. So he didn't do anything wrong, and that's why we always make sure to, clarify that ritual impurity it's not anything to look down on. It's just it's a condition that happens according to certain situations. But then it has to be addressed. You need to go through a purification before you can enter the temple. This is only really relevant when the temple is standing. Since the temple was destroyed and there are no waters of purification, all Jews are assumed to be in a state of tumah. This doesn't even apply to non-Jews. It's because they're not obligated in the laws of ritual purity. Okay, so the red heifer is needed for its ashes so that the ashes can be used in these waters of purification. So this says that if somebody misuses or somehow appropriates those ashes, for example, in the ancient times, maybe even today, ashes can sometimes be used medicinally. So if he used like ashes, these ashes of the red heifer, to like dab at a cut, if that was going to help him in some way, so he shouldn't do that, but he's not guilty of that Torah level transgression of misappropriating consecrated property. Why? The Mishnah taught that one who derives benefit from the ashes of a red heifer is not liable for misusing property consecrated to the temple. Rabbi Shimon bar Nachman said, in the name of Rabbi Yonasan, by Torah law, one should be liable for misusing it, i.e. the ashes of a red heifer, as it is consecrated to the temple, but the sages decreed that one is not liable. This, however, is difficult, as it was taught otherwise in the following Baraisa. With regard to a red heifer, the verse states it is a sin offering, which teaches that a red heifer is treated like a sin offering in that one is liable for misusing consecrated property with it. In other words, the animal itself. If there was a red heifer that had been set aside to be brought to the temple, slaughtered, and its ashes collected, etc., and you did something with that red heifer, you rode on it, you put your child on it, you used it, God forbid, to plow your field, yes, then you would certainly be guilty of misappropriating consecrated property. But only with it, the animal itself, is one liable for misusing consecrated property, but he is not liable for misusing consecrated property with the ashes of the red heifer. Therefore, it is clear from the Baraisa that by Torah law, one is not liable for misusing the ashes of the red heifer. And Rabbi Abahu said, indeed, there is no liability by Torah law for misusing the ashes of the red heifer. At first, however, the priests would treat the sanctity of the ashes lightly, and would clean themselves with them and even apply them to their wounds as medicine. And the sages therefore decreed that one does become liable for misusing consecrated property with them, i.e. the ashes of the red heifer. But when they saw that the priests restrained themselves and no longer used the ashes for anything except the purification water, the sages reverted to the Torah law and decreed that one does not become liable for misusing consecrated property if he somehow derives benefit from the ashes of the red heifer. That concludes our discussion of chapter 7. Now we move on to chapter 8. We are on the A side of page 21. The first Mishnah, now this chapter 8, the final chapter in Tractate Shekalim, very short chapter, a page and a half, concerns the ritual purity and impurity of objects which are found. Yesterday we were talking about what do we do with objects in the lost and found of the temple. Things that are found in the temple, near the temple, in Jerusalem. What are we supposed to do with them? Now we're at a more specific question. These certain things that are found in the temple, outside the temple, near the temple, in Jerusalem, can we assume that they are ritually pure, or should we assume that they are ritually impure, such that if we come into contact with these objects, we need to be concerned that we have contracted tuma, we become ritually impure, and now we are disqualified from entering the temple courtyard until we go through a purification process. That's the subject of this short chapter. The first Mishnah. The Mishnah discusses the ritual purity of items found either in the temple or in Jerusalem and its environs, in continuation of the previous chapter's discussion of money, animals, or meat that are found in these areas. All the spittle that is found in Jerusalem is ritually pure. Spittle, like spit that comes out of your mouth. Since neither ritually impure people nor non-Jews were commonly present in Jerusalem, the sages decreed an exception to the rule that spittle that is found anywhere else is ritually impure, since it presumably comes from one of those groups. Now, non-Jews are mentioned here. They are not subject to the laws of Tuma and Tahara, but at some point the sages decreed that non-Jews are going to they're going to have a sort of legal state, like a legal definition of being impure, because since they're not subject to those laws, they might have, touched a corpse or drag something or have something about their person which would not actually render them impure, but which might in certain cases, sort of bring that ritual impurity with them and come to transmit that to the Jew, who would then be disqualified from entering the temple. But in any case, the spittle that is found in Jerusalem is assumed to be pure because it doesn't come from ritually impure people or people that are legally defined as ritually impure. And this is the case except for spittle found in the upper marketplace, where Gentiles and ritually impure Jews were likely to be present. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yosei says, on all the other days of the year, i.e. any day that is not one of the 3 pilgrimage festivals, Passover, Shavuos, and Sukkot, spittle that is found in the middle of the street is ritually impure. And spittle that is found on the sides of the street is ritually pure. Why? According to Rabbi Yosef, it was common for people who were tameh, ritually impure, to be present in the streets of Jerusalem. They would be careful to walk in the middle of the street, while the tahor people, the ritually pure people who wish to remain tahor, ritually pure, would walk on the sides of the street. Therefore, it is reasonable to presume that spittle found in the middle of the street is from the tameh people, the ritually impure people, while spittle found on the side of the street is from somebody who is tahor, pure. But during the time of the festival, when most of the people in Jerusalem were there for the festival, and they would have to be ritually pure since they've come for the festival and they're going to enter the temple, they've been careful to keep themselves in a state of ritual purity. So then the spittle found in the middle of the street can be assumed to be tahor, ritually pure. And the spittle that's found on the sides of the street would be tameh, ritually impure. And the difference is due to the fact that at the time of the festival, the ritually impure minority moves on the sides of the street, and the majority who are tahor, ritually pure, move in the middle of the street. And in fact, that is the halacha. That's where that debate ended up. The Mishnah continues, all the vessels that are found in Jerusalem on the way down into the bathhouse, meaning where there's a pool for immersion, the mikvah, wherein one purifies vessels in the mikvah, are ritually impure. Why? Because if you find vessels on the one-way path that leads to the mikvah, you can assume that somebody dropped it when he was on his way to immerse that vessel in the mikveh and purify it. So you can assume that it is tameh, ritually impure. And those that are found on the one-way path up from the immersion mikveh, the toivel mikveh for objects, are ritually pure for the same reason. They were lost by somebody who's ascending from the mikveh, so he probably already immersed them, and they can be assumed to be tahor. The Mishnah explains, their descent into the bathhouse is not by the same route as their ascent out of it, and it can be assumed that those on the way down have not yet immersed and those on the way up have immersed. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. However, Rabbi Yosei says they are all ritually pure except for the basket and the shovel and the maritza, which are tools specifically used by grave diggers. So those tools which are commonly used in the practice of digging graves and are almost always tameh, ritually impure, no matter where they're found, we're going to assume that they are impure. But as for other kinds of vessels found on the streets of Jerusalem, whether it's on the way down to the mikveh or on the way up from the mikveh, we're just going to assume that they are tahor. And the Mishnah in Taharos 4:5 explains that the sages decreed that all vessels found in the markets and streets are ritually impure out of concern that they had been rendered impure by contact with a corpse. But the streets of Jerusalem are an exception to this rule, and we can assume that the reason it's an exception is because Jerusalem is the environment of the temple, and people are much more careful when they're in the vicinity of the temple, and so many of them have come to Jerusalem in order to visit the temple, and so everyone is more careful to keep themselves in a state of ritual purity. The Mishnah continues with another ruling about tahara, ritual purity. One may slaughter immediately with a knife that was found on the 14th of Nisan. What's the 14th of Nisan? Erev Pesach. What do we do on Erev Pesach? The afternoon before Passover begins that night. That is when the temple was standing, all the Passover lambs and kids, meaning goats, young goats, would be slaughtered at that time. So if somebody finds a knife on that day in Jerusalem, it's a very good assumption that somebody brought it in order to shecht a korban pesach, to shecht the paschal lamb, and so they would be careful to keep that knife in a state of ritual purity so that it could be used for that purpose. If, however, one finds a cleaver, which is used to slaughter an animal and break its bones, well, whether it was on this day, meaning the 14th of Nisan, or on that day, the 13th, the day before, he needs to immerse it again out of doubt. Since breaking the bones of the paschal lamb is prohibited, its owners would have no need for a cleaver on the 14th, and it cannot be presumed that it has already been immersed to make it ritually pure. However, if the 14th occurs on Shabbos, so then he may slaughter with the cleaver immediately, since immersing a vessel is prohibited on Shabbos, and presumably the owner of the cleaver wants it to be ritually pure on the 15th, when they're going to be slaughtering the festival peace offerings, so he would have immersed it on the 13th. That would be the normal assumption. And if you find this thing on Shabbos, so you can assume that it's in a state of ritual purity. If the cleaver was found on the 15th of Nisan, in other words, if it was found on the festival itself, he may slaughter with it immediately. The owners of the cleaver would have immersed it so that they could use it on the 15th to cut up the bones of a festival peace offering. If the cleaver was found attached to a knife, the knife is used for slaughter. The cleaver is used for, like a butcher, breaking up the animal into pieces. So then if you find the cleaver with a knife, the status of the cleaver is going to be whatever you would assume the status of the knife to be, since they were found together. Somebody probably had two tools, kept them together, and whatever he did to one, he did with the other. That's the first Mishnah of chapter 8. Now we go into the Gemara. The Mishnah taught that according to Rabbi Meir, all spittle that is found, sorry, it's a little gross, but as we've seen, the sages will, ask the question of any aspect of life so that we will know, what is the correct way to do? How are we going to follow God's will in every situation? All right, so what do we do with spittle? So the Mishnah taught that according to Rabbi Meir, all spittle that is found in Jerusalem is ritually pure, except if it were found in the upper marketplace. Now with regard to, because that's the place where ritually impure people would go. Throughout the rest of Jerusalem, ritually impure people would stay away. They know that they can't go into the temple, and they mustn't come into contact with people who are pure, because then they would disqualify the person who was pure, now became impure, from entering the temple, right? So they would keep a distance. And there you go. So, with regard to this, Rabbi Avin, in the name of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, explains, a fortress of non-Jews was there in the upper marketplace. And the sages decreed that Gentiles have the ritual impurity of a zav, that's a man who has experienced certain emissions. Therefore, their spittle is impure. And the Roman soldiers were non-Jews, so any spittle found in the upper marketplace was presumably theirs. The Gemara recounts an incident about this fortress. Rabbi Hanina said, once they were killing wild donkeys in Jerusalem to feed the lions in the circus. There's a sentence you don't hear every day. Once they were killing wild donkeys in Jerusalem to feed the lions in the circus. So right away we know this is during the times of the Roman occupation. Jews do not typically, I don't know if anyone outside of the Romans at the time of the Roman Empire was feeding animals to lions in a public display of a circus. But at any rate, the Romans were doing this, and they were killing wild donkeys. Now, donkeys are not a kosher animal, right? So we don't slaughter donkeys. If it's a work animal, if it dies, we bury it or do whatever we're going to do with it. Maybe feed it to the dogs. but we're certainly not slaughtering wild donkeys on any kind of normal basis. So the Romans were doing that, and the pilgrims coming to Jerusalem to celebrate the festival, Passover, or Shavuos or Sukkot, were wading in blood up to their ankles from the large amount of blood coming from the wild donkeys that were being slaughtered by the Roman soldiers. And they came before the sages to find out if they had been rendered ritually impure by the blood of the donkeys. And they, the sages, did not say anything, as the blood of an animal carcass does not render one ritually impure, even though the carcass does. This could be the carcass of a non-kosher animal or the carcass of a kosher animal that was not slaughtered in a kosher manner. If you touch that dead carcass, you contract tuma, ritual impurity. But the blood of that animal does not have the same status as its flesh. Okay, where did this story take place? Rabbi Shimon bar Abba said in the name of Rabbi Hanina, there was a Roman fortress there in the upper marketplace of Jerusalem, and that was where they were killing the wild donkeys. Apropos the ritual impurity of blood from an animal carcass, the Gemara recounts that Rabbi Simon said in the name of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, there was an incident with regard to a mule that belonged to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's household, and it died. And the sages ruled its blood, the blood of this mule, was it a mule? The mule, and the sages ruled that its blood is ritually pure. It is not impure and not subject to the impurity imparted by an animal carcass. Again, distinguishing between the blood of the carcass and the carcass itself. On this topic, Rabbi Elazar asked Rabbi Simon, up to how much blood, and I'm saying Simon, not Shimon. It's a different sage. Rabbi Elazar asked Rabbi Simon, up to how much blood from an animal carcass does not render one ritually impure? And he did not answer him. So he then went up and asked Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. And Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said to him, up to the size of a quarter lug is ritually pure. It's not a huge amount, maybe like sort of a palm full of blood. Less than that does not render you tameh, but more than that does, according to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, even though it's blood and not the carcass itself. And Rabbi Elazar was annoyed that Rabbi Simon did not respond with the law that the minimal size for the ritual impurity is a quarter lug, as he had certainly heard that law from Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. And the story just ends there. So we don't know why he was annoyed and why it was that Rabbi Elazar did not report that law that he had surely heard. Probably he might have heard it, but he was uncertain or he had some kind of an issue with it. But we're going to skip down a little bit further down. The Mishna states that according to Rabbi Meir's opinion, all the spittle found in Jerusalem is pure, except for the spittle found in the upper marketplace. And the Gemara asked, didn't Rabbi Abahu say this in the name of Rabbi Yosef ben Hanina? The sages did not decree the spittle found in Jerusalem to be ritually impure. If so, why is the spittle found in the upper marketplace ritually impure? And the Gemara answers, but wasn't it stated with regard to the marketplace that Rabbi Avin said in the name of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, a fortress of Gentiles was there, and since the sages decreed that Gentiles have the ritual impurity of a zav, any spittle found there must come from them, and therefore is ritually impure. The Mishnah also states Rabbi Yosef's opinion that for most of the year, all spittle, we already covered that. So that really restates what was already said. We have so much ground to cover. I'm going to move forward to the second Mishnah here in chapter 8. There are 4 Mishnahs in chapter 8. But they're all short and with very short commentary. Second Mishnah, with regard to a curtain that became ritually impure from a secondary source of impurity, since its ritual impurity is by rabbinic law and not Torah law, there is no need to remove it from the temple. Rather, it is immersed, right? It became impure, but it's a lower level of impurity. It needs to be immersed in order to become pure again, but you don't have to remove it from the temple courtyard. There's a place of immersion within the temple courtyard, and you just immerse this curtain right there within the courtyard. And if it were removed to outside the courtyard in order to immerse it, it can be brought back into the courtyard immediately. Since it is ritually impure only by rabbinic law, there is no need to wait until sunset before returning it. There's a concept of the tevel yom. Sometimes a person or an object becomes ritually impure. It needs to be immersed in the mikveh, in the purification water. Once it's been immersed, it is awaiting nightfall to complete its purification process. And so it is not completely pure until nightfall comes. However, with respect to this curtain in the temple, that was only impure by virtue of rabbinic impurity, not Torah level impurity. It can be immersed there, or if it was immersed outside, it can be brought back in. It's already pure. It's already at a sufficient state of purity for it to enter the precincts of the temple. But if it became impure from a primary source of impurity, for example, it came into contact with the carcass of one of the 8 creeping animals that confer impurity by Torah law, then it is immersed outside the courtyard and it is spread out to dry on the rampart. This is the low wall surrounding the temple courtyard and the buildings within it, which has a lower level of holiness than the courtyard. And the reason for this policy is because the sun needs to set on it in order to complete its purification. Immersion does not confer ritual purity on an item that became impure by Torah law until after the sun has set. And if this curtain were new, it is spread out to dry on top of the bench, a prominent place on the Temple Mount, so that the people will see its craftsmanship and perceive its beauty. Very beautiful. And the Gemara discusses the aforementioned curtain that separated the Holy of Holies from the sanctuary inside the indoor part of the temple. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, in the name of Rabbi Shimon, the son of the deputy high priest, the curtain. So get the picture, right? This is the curtain that separates the sanctuary. That is where the table with the showbreads was kept, and where the golden altar is, and where the candelabra, the menorah, was kept. Then there's that curtain, that very special, very holy curtain that separates between the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies, where in the first temple period and before, in the days of the tabernacle, that's where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, and where no one could enter except the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, on one day a year, Yom Kippur. At all other times, nobody enters there, and even on Yom Kippur, if that priest is in some way disqualified and he enters nevertheless, he could die because no one can enter there except a high priest in a state of top-level purity. So that curtain that separates the sanctuary from the Holy of Holies was a very special curtain, as we are about to hear. The curtain has the thickness of a handbreadth, right? So think of the thickness of my hand. That is how thick the cloth of the curtain was. I mean, honestly, if you imagine like a beautiful, beautiful velvet curtain, that hangs in a magnificent opera house, and it's like, 5 stories tall. But if you think about the cloth itself, it's not going to be as thick as my hand. That is very, very thick, heavy cloth. So why is it so thick? The curtain has the thickness of a handbreadth, and it is woven from 72 strands of yarn. And each and every strand from those 72 is made from 24 threads. And the curtain was made from 4 materials: sky blue wool, purple wool, scarlet wool, and fine linen. And a strand was made up of 6 threads of each type of material. And with regard to the dimensions of the curtain, its length was 40 cubits as the height of the ceiling of the sanctuary, and its width was 20 cubits to match the width of the entrance. And it was made from, get ready for this, 820,000 golden dinar. Now, what does that mean to be made out of golden dinar? Those are coins. It's not made of gold. It's not made of coins. So Rambam says this was the cost of the curtain, right? The curtain was so rich that it cost a tremendous amount of money to make it because so much craftsmanship went in it. Another interpretation, let me read that to you, about this. The text follows the interpretation of the Rambam, Maimonides, that this number is referring to the cost of the curtain. Other commentaries claim that it is referring to the number of young girls who have not yet matured and therefore are certainly ritually pure, who were needed to weave the curtain. Weaving was traditionally women's work, and in the temple, women would weave the curtain and were paid to do so. We'll encounter that teaching in Tractate Talmud. According to this view, the text should read 82 rivot, meaning girls, rather than ribo, meaning 10,000s. 82 10,000s is where we get that number, 820,000 dinar. Some explain that the number is referring to the number of threads that were in the curtain. So at any rate, it's an incredibly richly woven curtain. Okay, we get into the Gemara on this Mishnah. Skip down a little bit. The Gemara compares the workmanship of the curtain, which separated the Holy of Holies from the sanctuary, with that of the screen, which was hung at the entrance to the sanctuary. One verse about the screen says that it is the work of the embroiderer, and one verse about the curtain says that it is the work of the skillful workman. So that's Exodus 26:36 versus Exodus 26:31. And the Gemara explains the work of the embroiderer means that one face was on both sides of the curtain, and the work of the skillful workman means that there were two different faces, one on each side. Right? So they're disagreeing about like what exactly was embroidered on it. There were figures embroidered on the tabernacle, for example. I think there were figures of angels on there, and there was lions and eagles. There were other kinds of figures. And so this is the work of an embroiderer versus a really skilled craftsman. Is you can imagine just the embroiderer, when he makes a face appear on one side of the curtain, well, on the other side you see the backs of those threads, and so it's kind of the mirror image of that same face. But a truly skilled craftsman can embroider in a figure that appears on one side and doesn't appear on the other, so that on the other side you could have a different figure. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nehemiah disagreed about this. One said that the work of the embroiderer means that there was an image embroidered that could be seen from both sides. For example, a line from here and a line from there on the other side. But the work of the skilled workman means that the line could be seen from here, from one side, and it was smooth with no image on the other side. And the other sage said that the work of the embroiderer means that there was an image like a lion from here on one side, and it was smooth without an image on the other side. But the work of a skillful workman means that from each side a different image could be seen, like a lion on one side and an eagle on the other. With regard to this idea that the curtain was made from 82 10,000s of gold dinar, one interpretation, and that it needed 300 priests in order to immerse it, right? A large curtain that is as thick, the cloth is as thick as the width of my hand. Well, you can imagine that when you pull down that curtain, because it became impure for some reason, it needs to be immersed in water. It's so heavy that's going to take a lot of people to carry it. And earlier it said that 300 priests were needed to carry that curtain. So about that statement, Rabbi Yitzhak Bar Bizna said in the name of Shmuel, 300 priests to carry the curtain is a guzma, an exaggeration, a hyperbole for effect. And really a much smaller number of priests were needed. And similarly, we learned in a Mishnah there at Tamid 28b, with regard to the pile of ash on the altar, that at times there was on it as much as 300 kor, which is a huge amount. That's a number that you would use to measure grain from a huge field of grain. Regarding this, Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Boon, said in the name of Shmuel, this also is an exaggeration. So at times we find hyperbole used to make a point in the Talmud, but when we find a teaching that seems hard to believe for us, but no one says it's an exaggeration, so then we may not assume that it is an exaggeration. We continue with the third Mishnah here in chapter 8. With regard to the flesh of offerings of the most sacred order, like an elevation offering, also called a burnt offering, and this could be brought by Jews or non-Jews, but this would be a kosher animal slaughtered in a kosher manner and then taken up on the altar, and all of it is burned for a pleasing aroma to the Lord. So with regard to the flesh of the offerings of the most sacred order that became impure, whether it became impure from a primary source of impurity or from a secondary source of impurity, whether it became impure inside the courtyard or outside the courtyard, it must be burned. It cannot be burned on the altar. It must be burned somewhere else. It can no longer be brought as an offering because it's disqualified. Beis Shammai say it should all be burned inside the temple courtyard except for that which became impure from a primary source of ritual impurity outside the temple. It shouldn't be brought inside the temple since it became impure while it was outside the temple, and you cannot bring anything that's impure into the temple grounds for disposal of that by burning inside the temple grounds. Beis Hillel say it should all be burned outside the temple courtyard except for that which became ritually impure by a secondary source of impurity inside the temple courtyard. In such a case, the flesh need not be removed from the courtyard and it can be burned there. Rabbi Lazar says flesh from the offerings of the most sacred order that became ritually impure from a primary source of ritual impurity, whether it became so inside the courtyard or outside, is burned outside. Since its ritual impurity is of the most stringent type, it is not to be brought into the courtyard or allowed to remain there. However, an item that became ritually impure from a secondary source of ritual impurity, whether it became so inside or outside the courtyard, is burned inside. Since its ritual impurity is of a lenient type, it can be brought into the courtyard in order to be burned. Rabbi Akiva says the place of its impurity is where its burning should occur. Therefore, regardless of whether the source is primary or secondary, such flesh is burned wherever it presently is. Enough on that Mishnah. And now we proceed to the fourth and final Mishnah of chapter 8, and thus the final Mishnah of tractate Shekalim. The limbs of the daily offering were not placed directly on the altar fire. Instead, after cutting up the offering, its limbs were placed first on the ramp of the altar, from the halfway point and below, on the lower 16 cubits of the ramp, on its western side, and limbs of the additional offerings of the Shabbos and festivals were placed on the ramp from the halfway point and below on the eastern side. And the additional offerings of the new moon, like today's Rosh Chodesh Iyar, the first day of the Hebrew month of Iyar, so there would be additional offerings for the new moon, for the new Hebrew month. And those offerings were placed on top of the upper part of the edge of the altar. There was kind of like a rail where they could position these things. In other words, these offerings would sort of be lined up on the lower part of the ramp of the altar or on the edge around the altar, awaiting the priest who would then, when the moment was right, there was space for it, put it on the altar fire. They didn't just pile so much meat on there that it would put out the fire. So things had to be done one at a time when the fire, in keeping the fire hot enough to consume the meat of the flesh of these offerings. Another law, the obligation to give half shekels each year and to offer the first fruits is practiced only in the presence of the temple. In other words, when the temple is standing in Jerusalem. As fulfillment of these mitzvahs is only possible then. But the mitzvahs of produce tithes and grain tithes and of animal tithes and the sanctification of firstborn animals, these are practiced whether the temple is standing in Jerusalem or not, whether the temple is in existence or not. Although animal tithes and firstborn cannot be sacrificed without a temple, once they develop a blemish, they may be eaten by their owners. If in the present time, when there is no temple, one consecrates shekels for the mitzvah of the half shekel, or the fruits for the mitzvah of bringing the first fruits up to the temple in Jerusalem, if one consecrates for these purposes, they are consecrated and is prohibited to derive benefit from them. In other words, we don't have a temple now, so you can't consecrate shekels to give to the temple or consecrate first fruits to bring to the temple because there's no temple to bring it to. However, what this Mishnah is saying is, well, but if you did consecrate, you say, okay, I know there's no temple standing, but I want to consecrate this to the temple. So then have you said anything? Did you just change the status of that money and now made it holy, and therefore it can't be used by anybody for anything, and it's going to have to be cast into the Dead Sea and destroyed, because otherwise somebody who used that money would be misappropriating something that was consecrated for the use of the temple. Rabbi Shimon says, one who has declared first fruits to be consecrated in the present time when there is no temple, that applied even then after the temple was destroyed when Rabbi Shimon was making this ruling, one who declared first fruits to be consecrated in the present time does not give them that status, and they are not consecrated. Now that we've been talking about offerings pertaining to the new moon, like today, Rosh Chodesh for the month of Iyar is an example. When the new moon falls on Shabbos, sometimes Rosh Chodesh, the beginning of a new Hebrew month, and Shabbos coincide. And each of those, Rosh Chodesh and Shabbos, have a mussaf, additional offerings, right? So on Shabbos, like when we go to synagogue on Saturday morning and we do the regular morning service, and which includes the Shemona Esrei, the prayer, the standing prayer, and then we do an additional prayer called the Musaf Amida, the Musaf prayer, which corresponds to the additional offerings that were brought on Shabbos. When the temple was standing, there were daily offerings. There was an offering brought every morning of the year and every afternoon of the year. And on Shabbos, there were two additional offerings called the additional offerings of Shabbos. On Rosh Chodesh, there were also additional offerings. So the question is, when Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh coincide, when the temple was standing, which offering would be brought first? The additional offerings of Shabbos or the additional offerings of Rosh Chodesh? When the new moon falls on Shabbos and both the additional Shabbos offerings and the additional new moon offerings must be offered, which of them takes precedence? Asked the Gemara. Rabbi Yirmiyah thought to say that when additional Shabbos offerings and additional new moon offerings are both sacrificed, the additional new moon, Rosh Chodesh, offerings take precedence, and they are offered first. And the Gemara comments, and the strength of his argument lies in the fact that there was a Baraisa which taught when the new moon falls on Shabbos, the song sung by the Levites in the temple, the song of Shabbos that they would sing in the temple. When the temple was standing, the priests brought all the offerings and took care of all the sacrifices. And then there were Levites there who did all the other work, including singing in the choir. Right? So there were Levites who sung and played instruments. There was always music going on in the temple. It was a beautiful, beautiful experience to go to the temple. And there were particular songs that they only sang on particular days. So there was the song of Shabbos that was sung in the temple, and there was the song of Rosh Chodesh that was sung by the Levites in the temple. When Rosh Chodesh and Shabbos coincide on the same day, which song did the Levites sing first? And the answer is that the song of the new moon was sung first when Rosh Chodesh coincided with Shabbos. Rabbi Yosei said, yeah, that's true. They sang the Rosh Chodesh song before the Shabbos song, but we can't conclude that the offerings of Rosh Chodesh take precedence over the additional offerings of Rosh Chodesh take precedence over the additional offerings of Shabbos. Why? Because the law is different in the case of the song of the Levites. As Rabbi Chia said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the reason that the song of the new moon takes precedence over the song of Shabbos is in order to publicize the occasion and to inform everybody that the new month has begun. And this is in keeping with the system of the calendar that was in place still when the temple was standing. Not like today where the Hebrew calendar is set from now until the end of time. We know exactly when Rosh Chodesh is going to fall. But before the calendar was fixed in that way, originally, as dictated by the Torah, there was a Sanhedrin that met in the precincts of the temple, and they would receive testimony from witnesses who had witnessed that sliver of new moon, which told them that it was that the new month had begun, and then they would proclaim that the new month had begun, and then that proclamation would spread out, would be promulgated out from Jerusalem and throughout the Jewish world. In a time when there was no internet, no telegram, no Pony Express, it took a really long time for the word to get out. Originally, they speeded it up by using signal fires, but they had a problem with the Samaritans, who kind of didn't buy into the Sanhedrin and the leadership and interfered with the system of signal fires. And that is why we now have 2-day holidays outside of Israel and 1-day holiday in Israel, because outside of Israel, they could never be sure when the new month had begun. Right? So the song of the Levites for Rosh Chodesh would take precedence in the temple, because people would hear that song in Jerusalem and be reminded, okay, it's the new month, right? We can know that because of the song of the new moon. However, here, with regard to the additional offerings of Shabbos and the additional offerings of Rosh Chodesh, as opposed to the songs, the additional offerings of Shabbos go first. They take precedence, following the principle, which we've seen many times, that when a frequent practice and an infrequent practice clash, the frequent practice takes precedence over the other infrequent practice. Therefore, the sage is said to slaughter the additional Shabbos offering before the additional new moon offering. And that's generally so that we give precedence to something we do every day over something that we do once a year or once a month when those two practices have a conflict. And that's a beautiful teaching, right? Because the sages give great weight to something that we do on a regular basis, because that has the best chance of creating spiritual transformation within us. The Mishna stated that the obligation to give half shekels each year and to offer the first fruits is only practiced at the time the temple is standing. However, if one consecrates shekels or first fruits in the present day, they are nevertheless consecrated and is prohibited to derive benefit from them. Rabbi Shimon disagrees and says such an attempt to consecrate the first fruits would not be effective. And the Gemara points out, even according to Rabbi Shimon, this indicates that shekels would be consecrated if one did so in the present day. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda said in the name of Rabbi Shimon, contrary to this implication, no, both these first fruits and those shekels are not consecrated, right? If you try to consecrate things to the temple today, nothing happened. You didn't consecrate anything. The Gemara continues with a discussion of consecrated items in the present day. In the absence of the temple, it was taught in a Baraisa, a convert who converts in the present day is obligated to set aside in lieu of his pair of doves, which is one of the offerings that a convert would bring when he finishes his conversion and becomes a Jew. When the temple is standing, he would bring an offering to the temple. Now, people can convert to Judaism. If it's a male, he has to be circumcised. If he's already been circumcised medically, he has to have a ritual circumcision, which is just like drawing a bit of blood. And he has to say a bunch, he's tested and he says a bunch of prayers and blessings, etc. And he immerses in the mikvah, and then he's a convert. He doesn't bring that offering because the temple is not standing. But there was this idea at one time that, well, even though he can't bring the offering, he should put aside money to be as the cost of his offering so that he could still, do that. He could still participate in that beautiful offering that converts would bring when the temple was standing. However, the sages did away with that rule because that money was consecrated. It couldn't be deconsecrated by actually buying the bird offerings that he would bring at the time of the temple is standing. So it's consecrated money that can't be used for anything. And he might put it aside as special money, but then one day he dies and somebody else finds that money. It's just money, so they go and spend it. And now that person would be guilty of misappropriating consecrated property. So they did away with this practice. And that concludes Tractate Shekalim, except for one restatement of this point that we don't, if somebody tries to consecrate something today for the use of the temple, it doesn't take. Rav Chamnuna and Rav Ada bar Ahava said in the name of Rav, the halacha, the law, is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, that such consecrations are not consecrations. And that concludes Tractate Shekalim. So when we finish a tractate of the Talmud, normally we would stand and say Kaddish, but we need a minyan for that, so we can't say Kaddish. And then I'm going to read, it's a little bit more involved when you do this in Hebrew. It should be done standing, but then I wouldn't be on camera. So here is the Hadran. We shall return to you, Tractate Shekalim, and your glory is upon us. Our thoughts are upon you, Tractate Shekalim, and your thoughts are upon us. We will not be forgotten from you, Tractate Shekalim, and you will not be forgotten from us, neither in this world nor in the world to come. May it be your will, Lord, our God and God of our ancestors, that your Torah will be our avocation in this world and will accompany us to the world to come. Chanina bar Papa, Rame bar Papa, Nachman bar Papa, Achai bar Papa, Abba Mari bar Papa, Rafram bar Papa, Rachish bar Papa, Surha bar Papa, Ada bar Papa, Daru bar Papa. Those are the sons of Rabbi Papa, who, raised 10 sons to be Torah scholars. And we remember his great merit. He was a great sage in himself, and he raised 10 sons to all be Torah scholars. And we invoke his merit so that our families should transmit the values of Torah down through the generations. Please, Lord our God, make the words of your Torah sweet in our mouths and in the mouths of your people, the house of Israel, so that we, our descendants, and their descendants, if we're blessed to have grandchildren, and the descendants of your people, the house of Israel, may all know your name and study your Torah for its own sake. Your commandments make me wiser than my enemies, for they are ever with me. Let my heart be undivided in your statutes, in order that I may not be put to shame. I will never forget your precepts, for with them you have quickened me. Blessed are you, O Lord. Teach me your statutes. Amen. 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 Selah forever. We give thanks before you, Lord our God and God of our ancestors, that you have placed our lot among those who sit in the study hall, and that you have not given us our portion among those who sit idly on street corners. We rise early and they rise early. We rise early to pursue matters of Torah, and they rise early to pursue frivolous matters. We toil and they toil. We toil and receive a reward, and they toil and do not receive a reward. We run and they run. We run to the life of the world to come, and they run to the pit of destruction, as it is stated. But you, God, will bring them down into the pit of destruction. Men of blood and deceit shall not live out half their days. But as for me, I will trust in you. May it be your will, Lord my God, just as you have assisted me in completing Tractate Shekalim, so assist me to begin other tractates and books and conclude them, to learn and to teach, to observe and to perform, and to fulfill all the teachings of your Torah with love. And may the merit of all the Tanaim and Amoraim and Torah scholars stand for me and my descendants, so that the Torah will not move from my mouth and from the mouths of my descendants and the descendants of my descendants forever. And may the verse, when you walk, it shall lead you. When you lie down, it shall watch over you. And when you awaken, it shall talk with you. Be fulfilled in me. For in the Torah, your days shall be multiplied, and the years of your life shall be increased. Length of days is in her right hand. In her left hand are riches and honors, meaning the Torah. Right, in the Torah's right hand, and the Torah is likened, is described here as female. Length of days is in her right hand. In her left hand are riches and honor. May the Lord give strength to his people. The Lord will bless his people with peace. And we say, Amen. And then, because we've just finished a course of study, we immediately begin the next one. So I'm just going to read the very first line of Tractate Yom, the Laws of Yum Kippur, which we'll start tomorrow. All books of the Talmud begin on page 2. That's the numbering convention. So the first Mishna of Tractate Yom, 7 days prior to Yom Kippur, the sages would remove the high priest, who performs the entire Yom Kippur service, from his house to the chamber of Parhedron, a room in the temple designated specifically for the high priest during that period. So we have opened our study of Masechet Yoma. We have started. We'll continue that tomorrow. And I'll tell you that when we actually study the choreography of what the high priest did on the day of Yom Kippur and how he prepared for Yom Kippur, what he did on Yom Kippur, how he celebrated after Yom Kippur. It's very moving. It's very, very beautiful. So we're definitely in for a treat as we enter Tractate Yoima. This class has been running for an hour, so I'm going to go pretty quick in terms of questions. Okay, I'm not sure if Nina is back. Probably, yeah, she's not back yet. So I need to scan for questions myself. Let me see what I can do. It's hard to sort of read them quickly. That's why Nina does this. But Yehudit says, thank you, Nina and Sal, for your continued determination of giving your time and learning Talmud with us. And also thank you for your efforts of creating this wonderful community. Hazaku Baruch. May you be strengthened and blessed. Thank you, Yehudit. And may the blesser be blessed. It's a beautiful response. When somebody offers you a blessing, you could say to them, may the blesser be blessed. There seems to be a discussion. That's great. You guys are answering each other's questions. Sharon says, it is interesting that both the clothing of the high priest and the curtain are made of shatnez, with wool and linen woven together. Yeah, so why don't we just leave it at that? Isn't that interesting? So one of the chukim, there are laws in the Torah, there are mishpatim and chukim and other kinds of laws as well. But the difference basically is that some laws, they just, make sense to us. They intuitively make sense. You shall not kill. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You can't run a civilized society if people are going around killing each other and stealing from each other and lying in court, etc. But you may not wear wool and linen together, just like you may not plow with an ox and a donkey together, or you may not plant, grain and grapes in the same plot. Why? Why can't you do those things? It's just one of those things that God said so, and that's why we do it. You may not boil a kid in its mother's milk. That used to be considered a delicacy. You may not eat lobster. Why? There's nothing wrong with lobster. Many people around the world enjoy lobster, love lobster, and God bless them, they should enjoy the lobster. But God said to the Jews, you can't eat lobster, so we can't. So shatnez is you can't wear a garment made of wool and linen together. In fact, I once bought a nice Hugo Boss suit. I got such a good deal. But then I looked into it, and it had a shatnez problem because the backing of the collar, it was a wool suit, but it had linen in there. So I had to take it to a special place, the shatnez lab, who removed that backing and replaced it with a backing that was kosher for the suit. It ended up being not such a good deal on the suit. But we can't wear wool and linen together. But the priests were commanded to wear wool and linen together. Again, we can't because God said so. The priest must because God said so. We don't understand why. Now, we can look into the soul of the Torah and try to derive teachings from that. And so many of these laws in the Torah are about, making distinctions, separating between two things, saying they're not the same. And God bless the diversity of this world and the fact that one thing is not the same as another and that we keep them distinct and don't just run everything together. But the exact nature, why we do it, it's really what it is. It's an opportunity to do what God said. And that gives pleasure to God. How do we know? Because God said so in the Torah. That when we burn sacrifices that we've been commanded to burn, it is a pleasing aroma to the Lord. And as Rashi tells us, what is pleasing about this aroma? God doesn't need our food. God doesn't need to eat at a barbecue. He's everywhere. He's everything. He doesn't have a body that needs to be fed. But it's pleasing to God that he commanded something and we did it. So he gave us this opportunity to give him pleasure, just like parents derive pleasure from their kids. When we tell them to do what's good for them, they don't understand it. But if they do it because we said so, that gives pleasure to the parent. And we have that opportunity with our parent in heaven. That's what I've got for us today. May we all be blessed to begin and complete many tractates of study in our lives together as a community. And we say amen and have a great night.